Good afternoon, everyone. We are super excited to be here. You are in the right place. We are hosting a WorkBuzz webinar today on the evolution of employee listening. The title says it all, really. I think what we've seen in the last few years is a shift away from the annual survey being a nice to have to it really being a critical solution for solving key people and business challenges. I think our State of Employee Engagement, our 2022 research, prioritised top priorities for HR at the moment are around improving employee engagement and experience, attracting talents and retaining talents. And these are closely followed by culture, learning and development and employee wellbeing. So if you haven't got a copy of that, I'd really recommend going to our website and downloading a latest copy of the State of Employee Engagement research. But unpicking that comes from the insights that we can get from employee listening. So what we're here today to talk about is the evolution of this, where it started, where we're seeing it move to, and we're joined by the fabulous Neil Hayward, who has hosted many webinars with us and is my absolute partner in crime, I think, from a webinar perspective. But Neil has more than 25 years of experience working as an exec and non-exec director. He's worked in organisations from the Post Office through to Standard Chartered Bank and not ended his career, but ended the, what should we call it? The corporate chapter of his career at HS2 and was involved in the Engage for Success movement when it first became a thing, and more recently implemented a really strategic employee listening strategy at HS2. So we're really privileged to have him here. Have I summarised your background enough, Neil? Did you want to expand on that a little bit?
Been more than kind and generous as always, but I mean, yeah, just a couple of kind of points of information for people listening. There are always pioneers, and I give credit to lots of people that I've worked with. So if I go back in time 20-25 years, the first person who really talked to me about employee listening was Dr. Tim Miller, who was actually the kind of group HR director at Standard Chartered for over 14 years. He did his doctorate in workplace performance and management behaviours, which he qualified with in about 2007. And he was a kind of inspirational, larger-than-life figure who now has a sort of successful portfolio non-executive career. But his research kind of pointed the way to employee listening and the impact it might have on performance and productivity in the workplace. And then a few years later, and it was only a few years, about 2009, Lord Mandelson, who was the Labour Party business secretary in Gordon Brown's administration, he commissioned David MacLeod and Nita Clark to do a study, which was called Engaging for Success, which was published just about the end of 2009. And Lord Mandelson was interested around whether a wider take-up of employee engagement, whether that could be something that would improve UK performance and productivity. I mean, really quite an apposite comment now, really, given as the UK economy heads into a recession. And that report said, our answer is an unequivocal yes. Over the past 8 months, we've seen numerous examples of companies and organisations where performance and profitability have been transformed by employee engagement. And I guess that was part of the original inspiration for my interest in this subject. That reference point, that study, covered 2 organisations that I worked with, Serco and Standard Chartered, and I've kind of been developing the ideas that came from Tim's work and from the Engaging for Success movement in organisational life ever since. But the original inspiration and the backdrop and the credit and the kudos sits with people like Tim and the original David MacLeod, Nita Clark, and all of those survey participants. Perhaps just one other quote for you. And this is what I passionately believe in my kind of non-executive portfolio life now. Organizations are social networks. Ignoring the people dimension, treating people as simply cogs in the machine, results in the full contribution they could make being lost. And that's why employee listening for me is vital and fundamental. And it makes no odds whether the economy is growing and companies are in the upside of a cycle or whether they're in a downside or recession. You kind of ignore that statement at your peril, in my view.
Sorry, Neil, my internet connection just froze a little bit there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's amazing context. And I think that's why it's so great to have you here today, because it's talking to all that experience and all the things that have influenced you along the way. But I think the pandemic has actually impacted on the need for more regular listening. And I think in our latest research, that's definitely what we've seen when we surveyed across the UK to HR directors. And it really showed that 37% of organisations now are surveying quarterly or more frequently, which is a really shift from back in 2018 when we first started doing the state of employee engagement research. In your experience, I know that you will have run annual surveys, and at HS2 you had to move to more regular listening pretty quickly. What has been your experience in how an organisation is able to listen better when it's done more frequently?
Yes, I mean, my experience would reflect these survey findings, which is that if you really are running an employee listening strategy, you will be using multiple channels much more frequently to get insights into what your employees are thinking and feeling. And I think my advice to HR professionals is you need to think about the channels and kind of root it in strategy. So let me just sort of make this clear, because beneath these survey findings, there's inevitably a question around what are you surveying people on, which is a matter of strategic intent. So if you're having trouble recruiting people, you clearly should be conducting candidate surveys to find out what it is about the experience of you hiring them that is making sure that they end up going somewhere else. If you're losing people after a relatively short period in your organization, perhaps the root cause is something to do with what you promised them or how you've onboarded them. So you should be asking them questions about onboarding. And then once you're inside an organization as an employee, my sense is you have to think about how you actively retain people by being always on with their voice and listening to their voice. And that is about feedback channels for them. It's about your pulse and engagement survey tools. It's about ad hoc meetings, one-to-one. It's about focus groups. It's about action planning. It might even be as direct as sort of stay interviews. If the concern that's emerging from your kind of surveys and pulse or one-to-one meetings or feedback from managers is that development is a concern in the organization, then again, you have to think about listening through a development lens, in which case you're going to want to establish one-to-one meetings with your talent. You're going to want to be doing 360-degree feedback on the environment in which you're trying to grow and develop that talent. And then lastly, and I think this is the bit that organizations miss, mainly because when people leave an organization, there's a tendency to regard it as a cause that's been lost already. But you can get an awful lot of insight at the end of the cycle with offboarding, your exit interviews and exit surveys, because that will give you a further clue as to what it is about recruitment, onboarding, retention, development that you might have missed at the point that they're leaving. And actually, by the way, sometimes people just leave for very good reasons. They're not unhappy with you and your organization. They've genuinely got a better opportunity, and we should celebrate with them. And you never say never. So a sense of listening is for me about the channels and about a strategy that sets how and why you use the channels. So when I look at the move towards more frequent surveying of people, if you've really rooted this in listening frequently, you'll be listening through the lens of certain subjects based on what the issues are that your employees are telling you about, or what your workforce data is telling you might be your biggest risk or might be going wrong in your organization already.
And I think that if we take it up a level and think about what an employee listening strategy is, it has to start with that why, doesn't it? It makes it a strategic tool when it's linked to what matters most across the organization. So I think to your point, what you talk to here is on the line that we see at the bottom, it's surveying from recruitment all the way through to exit. And we often talk about the moments that matter and, using those pivotal moments to really understand the things that matter most to the employees at those times. But I think what I'm hearing is that employee listening, it's not just about surveys. It is literally a holistic approach to actively listening. I think that's the key word there, isn't it? It's about actively listening. It's not just listening. You have to take action on the back of it and join the dots for the individuals in the organisation to show that you have listened and you are making changes on the back of it.
Here's the big change that we're talking about since that original Engage for Success movement and the early pioneers. Employee listening, as you've just said, it goes beyond regular employee engagement surveys and annual surveys, or at least it should do. My question to those listening or who hear this podcast separately is, what is it that you're doing? Because you need to be thinking of pulse surveys, candidate feedback, onboarding feedback, stay interview questions, exit interviews. All of that is part of a continuous listening strategy. And then if you have employee forums or you have third parties, union recognition agreements, they are also sources of guidance on what's happening inside your organization that you shouldn't ignore. So if we go back to kind of the early 2000s, when a large number of companies did an annual employee survey and then didn't do very much with it, we're now in a world where, with increasingly challenging circumstances in which to hire and keep people, I'd say probably 3/4 of organizations are certainly using more than one, and certainly several of those potential options in a sort of to create their employee listening channel. Think about it as a continuous conversation between your organization and your people, and then think about it about how you create a culture in which management are replicating that day to day in talking with their team members, and think about the fact that the virtuous circle isn't closed unless the conversations are happening as frequently as the listening interventions are happening.
Yeah. And I think what we've seen at WorkBuzz is that shift to shorter surveys as well. So it's about bite-sized feedback, not about lengthy action plans where you're having to try and digest the results of a 50-question survey. It's much shorter 15-question pulses that enables you to have meaningful conversations with your team. And the only way that you're going to truly empower leaders across an organization is by giving them easy to understand data that they can weave into what's happening already. It doesn't require almost like a separate action to make changes on the back of it. It has to be simple. So I think when we talk about the evolution of employee listening, what is an employee listening strategy? I think for me, it's always about keeping it simple. And it's about making sure that the way you talk about employee listening, the intent that you set, the questions that you ask, is all about enabling very meaningful, easy conversations for anyone at any level to be having across the organization.
Yep, completely agree with you.
And why, it's always about the why, isn't it? But why do we need an employee listening strategy?
I think most people will answer this in a particular way, which is that you want continuously to receive feedback about what it's like working for you. And that's the kind of answer I've got there. But I mean, to me, that feeds through into some other reasons, which is this is how you make sure you're employee centric, which means you can differentiate from your competitors. This is what enables you to take action more quickly that may well lead to improvements in performance and productivity. And ultimately, this is how you could win the war for talent in tight labour market conditions. Incidentally, I was asked just yesterday at another organisation that I work with, and you may be experiencing this in your organisations. I was asked, well, the recession's coming, so we don't really need to worry about this employee listening, employee experience thing anymore, do we? Because there'll be plenty of people. There'll be more people available than there are jobs. Well, I would suggest that if you're dealing with people inside your organization who believe that, they're being a little naive. But the data spells out that assertion. It is true that job vacancies have come down for 4 months in a row if you look at the UK economy, but we've still got about 1.3 million vacancies in the UK at the moment, and that is a situation replicated across quite a large number of the developed economies in the world. And we've also lost something in the order of 700,000 to 800,000 workers from the UK economy as a result of a combination of both Brexit and COVID. So the reality is there is a shortage of labour in the UK market, and demographically that's not going to close with an influx of school leavers until about 10 years from now. So I would say that you know, recessions have some impact on whether people move jobs and have some impact on the ease of getting them through into your organization. But an assumption that all of a sudden you don't have to work at it, and that you're no longer putting an employee voice at the heart of your thinking, and that you're not listening in order to shape that voice and opinion, I think that's a dangerous assumption. I mean, my advice would be, if your organization is thinking about doing that, then you should be working for one of your competitors who isn't, because they're going to do much better than your organization.
And culture came through really strongly in the state of employee engagement and in many of the conversations that we're having. It is the differentiator that we have. So understanding why people choose to stay with us and, you know, why they're thinking about leaving. I think most conversations I'm having at the moment are around the continuing challenge of retention. So if we're not listening regularly and we're not understanding how the world of work is changing for our people at all levels across the organization, then I often say, what you don't know, you don't know. So you're making assumptions, but you're going blind to a degree. So employee listening, when done right, as a strategic tool, gives you that ability to truly make data-driven people decisions, doesn't it? And have the data to back it up. Absolutely.
The words that are important here, based on what you've just said, is that understanding your employees better is great. But actually, if you don't take quick action and make an assumption that you're not doing this as a one-off, but you're doing this as part of who you are and how you do business, that your employees come first, because if you do that, then the customers come first. If you haven't got that as a mindset, then it's going to be hard work.
And that actually reminds me of a really important shift that we've seen as well, is that the way that we ask questions, the tone of voice that we use in our surveys, you know, they are much more employee focused than they have ever been. I think if we look back to when annual engagement surveys first became a thing, they were very strategic, business-oriented questions, weren't they? Whereas now, I think we're seeing a lot more, I don't know what the word is really, humanity coming into the way that we ask questions in the surveys as well. And it's really using it as a strategic tool to pull out stories, you know, like, what has been your proudest moment at work? You know, what's a good thing that's happened to you in the last month? And really using it as a point in time reflection for employees to think about how they feel about work, not just about the improvements that need to be made as well. And I think when it's done to look at all of those things, you know, to pull out the positives as well as the things that need improving, then it changes the way that people think and feel about employee listening as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's been a big shift that we've seen as well. So how do you develop an employee listening strategy? You've obviously done this a few times. So where do you start?
Well, you know, any strategy has to be rooted in the reality of the organization you're in. It's not an abstract thing. It's actually the experience of your organization. So you do have to start by considering what the business and people strategy is, because that should be helping you develop your people strategy and then your employee listening strategy. So for example, your employee listening efforts need to make sense in the context of what your organization is doing. Do you want to equip managers with insights to better lead and motivate their teams to work more efficiently? Or do you want to evaluate the success of various milestones throughout an extensive workforce transformation? Everything is about the context. So you have to start with what the business goals say. And then one of the things that I then encourage HR folk to do is to not work in isolation. You have to think about who's interested in what you're doing and why, and how you make this appeal to them. So your stakeholders are certainly going to be the organization's leadership. It's got to be the business leadership at the top. You need IT on board because they're going to support the technology side of things. You certainly probably want legal involved because there's going to be some guidance on privacy, data protection, data management issues if you're running surveys or any form of listening. You want line managers to be communicated with in advance because they're going to need to role model and encourage participation in whatever intervention you're making. You want communications on board because they're going to monitor existing employee sites for insights. You want marketing to work with HR on branding related to how this is all presented externally. So that's what I'm saying is you're not developing an employee listening strategy in isolation. And then for it to be a success, it's crucial that you make sure that your employees believe you and feel comfortable sharing their opinions without fear of reprisals or retaliation. So you're going to need to demonstrate to them up front there's privacy, data protection, confidentiality, all of those things. And then there's the question around, well, what technology do you use? Surveys are going to be a large part of it, obviously, but if you send out too many of them, if they're too long, your employees will grow tired of them. So there's a whole balance of this as to how frequently and when you put the interventions in place. I always argue that you can't ignore, you have to still include in-person and virtual focus groups. I also argue that in some companies, particularly when you have significant third party, you might want to think about your wider workforce. So I worked with an organization, HS2, that had a very large number of contractors and interims and temporary staff, as well as a core workforce. So does the survey include everyone, or was it just employees? We included everyone. And then you've got to think about survey fatigue. So you need to plan this in advance because you've got to think about how much, with what frequency, over what time period. So you can't develop an employee listening strategy unless you're looking through the lenses of all of these questions, I would suggest. Now, ask yourself, sitting at home in your organization, did I consider all of those questions, or do I need to consider all of those questions with the way I'm doing any of this at the moment? My lived experience was the common mistakes are around the workforce, the survey fatigue, and in particular, getting key stakeholders on board up front. And I think that's the most crucial one.
I do too. And I think that absolutely lends itself to the experience that I've had implementing employee listening strategies as well. I think we can't underestimate the role of internal comms as well. I think on some of the most powerful strategies that we've implemented, internal comms have played a crucial role in helping us understand the needs of those stakeholders as well, and really helping us kind of embed this across the organisation. A really practical example where you talk about including focus groups in the wider workforce as well is when we've run the questions past employees. They've given feedback about even the order of the questions and said, do you know what, make it about me first. Don't ask me about the strategic priorities of the organisation first. Ask me about my experience at work and then ask me about the other stuff. And it really changes.
It does. I mean, I absolutely signed off. I mean, it's hard work being an HR director sometimes. I can remember the work that I had to put in getting the top table to agree that we were going to operate a listening strategy, and then whatever the survey tool was, the question set and so on. And of course, there's always a propensity for a CEO to write and design the questions themselves. That's another thing that I'm sure you've all experienced. But let's say you can get that work done, because actually as HR professional, we're used to engaging with the most senior people. The most valuable forum that I took anything to before I launched any aspect of a listening or engagement strategy was the kind of employee workplace forum. We had employee representatives, not union representatives, employee forum. We used to take it there, and we used to use their insights and guidance on forming the questions and on taking action when we got the survey insights back, whatever it was.
Yeah, and a model that we've put together at WorkBuzz is what we call our cultural maturity model. And for those that haven't seen this on the call, then it's just simple stepping stones that gets you thinking about where to start and ultimately what you're trying to link everything to. So if we look to the left and think about what Neil said to start with, the way that we're going to make this successful is around aligning it to a strategy and vision. Because if we start with the end in mind, we know what we're looking to solve for, then we can win hearts and minds, which is the second part of the model, because then we change mindsets. And it's not just about a response rate and an employee engagement score. It's about the impact that the employee listening strategy is going to have for them in their teams. We get leaders bought in, we prepare them for that feedback culture, which is not about lengthy action plans. It's about enabling them to have meaningful conversations, not necessarily having all the answers, but being confident enough to take those results back to their teams and start the conversation, because that's where the real action can happen. If we get that bit right, then we do inspire action. We can turn those insights into action. We empower people leaders because we've given them clear insights, and we close that stage gap. And that's often what we see, is just that miss of joining the dots between the action that you've taken and where the idea came from in the first place. And it's obviously generally from that employee voice piece. And then the making smarter people decisions has been the biggest shift from an evolution of employee listening perspective, because it's now about leveraging leading data. So genuinely, like Neil said, put in employee listening at the heart of your business strategy, using that to pivot when you need to check in to make sure that your strategies are working, and genuinely to keep your finger on the pulse of how things are changing over the time. And just to link it back, as we go into a recession, there's no more important time to be doing that, because the world is going to be changing so quickly again. But ultimately, it's about enabling you to focus on the moments that matter across the employee life cycle and create that single view of the employee experience through all of those things that we're talking about, with that holistic view of the employee listening strategy. And if we get that bit right, then we can link it back through the engagement data that you're collecting to things like retention and absenteeism and productivity and customer satisfaction and all those important business metrics as well. So hopefully this gives you almost a journey and to think about where you are right now and the areas that you might need to think about as you evolve your own employee listening strategies inside your own organizations. Neil?
And this is perhaps just one other question that you might consider. You may be working with survey providers from sources other than WorkBuzz, but ask yourself the question, the people I'm working with, are they providing me with survey tools and a technology platform, or are they helping me frame an employee listening strategy that's going to work for my organization, where I'm enabled to take action that will make a tangible difference? Because at WorkBuzz, I believe that's what you're about, and the mission of the organization is changing the lives of 1 million people at work. There are lots of people offering technology and processes and surveys, but I think actually working through this framework and the way WorkBuzz works with customers gets you to the end of this cultural maturity model, which is demonstrating ROI. And we all know that in a world in which money is scarce and recessions are happening, that ROI question is going to become more, not less relevant to us in HR as we defend what we're doing and defend our budget. So I quite like the fact that when WorkBuzz works with people, it's about establishing a shared mission to make a difference together by using each other properly, working together. That's not what a lot of other survey providers, because that's what they are only, provide.
Yeah, and we often talk about the intent behind what we do and just elevating that conversation up a level to really get you thinking as an organisation why you're doing what you're doing. So if anyone's got any questions, please do use the Q&A as we're going through. But let's just talk about the key lessons that you've learned, Neil.
Yeah. So I think this is sort of a summary of the things we've been discussing. So you don't frame your employee listening strategy by doing it as a sort of desktop exercise inside HR. There is a wide number of other people that you might wish to consider, and you can frame and test and sign off your strategy, in particular by using focus groups and in-person conversations. You do have to be transparent from the start and set the intent clear from the start. And I think that's around helping people understand what you're trying to do and why. And in particular, that's a good mitigant against the kind of survey fatigue risk. The communications point is kind of obvious, but sometimes it's less easy to make that happen inside an organization, in particular if communications hasn't been bought into and signed off the strategy and isn't working with you collaboratively as part of the design, development and delivery of your employee listening strategy. So think of them as partners rather than as another function that you have to try and get on board late, get them on board early. And at the end of the day, none of this matters unless you're prepared to take some action and join the dots for people. And by the way, at this point, I would say this is one of the other areas where communications comes in particularly helpful. You have to communicate that you've taken action for people in a way that makes sense to people in the language that they understand. And it's not just about the messaging, it's about saying something's changed. It has to be something done, not something talked about.
Yeah. And I think that brings it back to point 2 around setting that intent from the start. I think what I've seen work really well across organizations when they've almost created a vision for their employee listening strategy and clearly stated what that is in a couple of sentences. And then they've tasked everybody to communicate it in the same way. So there's no kind of grey areas around what's trying to be achieved through it and with it. And everyone's really clear about that intent from the start. Yeah. And I think that has to come from the top down.
Yeah, that comms plan is not just information about the survey results and what you plan to do. It's what you've done and sharing the success stories. So when you're developing your communications plan, you have to keep all of your employees in mind, both frontline and deskless workers and office knowledge workers. And you have to think about how you're going to reach them and ensure they actually get to read and understand the information that you're giving them. And that will most likely vary. So everything here is around a sort of strategy for communication, really. I think we're taking action, by the way.
Just on that, Neil, we've just, sorry, go on.
Go on, you go, carry on.
No, we just had a question actually from Sam. It says, the main feedback we have had is that actions haven't been visible enough. We've tried to communicate these, but I wonder if people expected to see a big change overnight. So any tips around managing expectations on actions and time it takes to change culture? Great question.
This is a great question. I think this comes from what I describe as the verbal communications rather than the written communications. So I've worked in organizations where the challenge of the cultural change or the things that needed to be improved were so significant that to say that we're going to get it all done in the next 2 or 3 months just wouldn't have been believable or tangible. So actually, then the communication strategy, and I'm working with an organization facing the same dilemma now, the communication strategy was about, we're going to get these things done by date X, which are the small things that are niggling and getting in the way, because that establishes credibility. And then with the large things, there was a commitment to provide regular updates on them. And every time you do that update, you start off by reminding people why you're talking about the subject. So you kind of create what I describe as a "you said we are doing" conversation versus a "you said and we've already done" conversation. As long as you're framing the fact that things you are doing are because you've heard something, then you are suggesting automatically to the people in the organization that you're taking the issues and concerns that they have entirely seriously. So that would be my advice. And of course, keep pinpointing the success stories.
And I think just to add to that, I think when we talk about setting the intent from the start, I think often you can do that in a really human way to say, do you know what, we're going to ask these questions. We might not have all the answers straight away. Yes. And I think that's okay too, to be really and almost position your employee listening strategy that way. But I think ultimately it's how you cascade those actions down through the organization as well. So it's not just about HR and the leadership making those changes. It's about empowering people leaders at all levels to have 1 or 2 key actions that they can take away from the results that they see for their teams as well. And I think if you can get that bit done and it becomes embedded across the organization then, and it's not seen as a HR thing, it's seen as a wider strategic part of what you do. It's just part of what we do here. So that would be my advice as well.
Yeah. Totally.
Any other questions on that before we just move on to the next slide? No, we'll move on. Oh, yeah, got another question coming through. Oh, very helpful. Good. Thanks, Sam. And do reach out if you want to dig into that a little bit more. If we move on to this one, Neil, I think this is quite a powerful slide that you kind of conclude with, really.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a cause and effect thing. You start off by, you've sold people the idea that working for your organization is going to be something. So your approach to employee listening is about testing whether that's true or not. That's what that initial statement is all about. By the way, I think that's a confident and bold statement. I don't think every organization is able or willing to do this. But if you're mis-selling your organization against the reality, then clearly once people come into your organization, they're going to be unsettled and unhappy for various reasons. So your approach is about whether your employees are experiencing what you told them they would experience. And then, what they tell you, I see it as a kind of risk assessment. And as we said earlier on, that is about every part of the employee life cycle. Your HR data should tell you what the concerns are. At HS2, we had trouble getting candidates through into positions. We had lots of candidates dropping off, so we had something going wrong with our hiring process. And again, we were seeing that people were leaving us earlier than we would have liked, not long after probation period. So we questioned whether our onboarding was right. So we drilled into that and asked more questions. So you have to use the right insights. So your employee listening provides you with a risk assessment, and then you complete the loop with this next statement. So enabling, taking action mitigates the risk. So there's a kind of virtuous circle here. You give someone a promise of what life's going to be like inside your organization. You're checking it is and making adjustments continually in response to their feedback. And by doing that, you remove a number of the risks. And what I'm really saying is employee listening is a truly great way to improve your employee experience. If you do it well, it kind of feels like you're creating an employee-centric organization where every employee, kind of regardless of their background, feels valued and is aligned to what you're doing and where you're taking them. And if you're not, well, you're kind of moving the organization ahead somewhat blind, and you might be right and you might be wrong, but only time will tell. And you'll see it play out in your workforce dynamics without any question.
And I think especially like when we speak to lots of organizations at the moment, it's about building an inclusive culture. If you're building an inclusive culture, you genuinely have to give everybody the ability to have their say and, take their responses seriously. So the other evolution that we've seen, I guess, just to wrap it up in terms of employee listening, is that ability to slice and dice the data from your surveys in really powerful ways to support that. And it's the intersectionality of the data that's important as well. So being able to look at your employee data through the lens of team, role, geography, gender, ethnicity, manager versus non-manager, apprentices, graduates, that ability to be able to look at the employee experience and how that differs, how that experience can be so radically different depending on who you are and where you sit within an organization is key when it's all about building an inclusive culture as well.
Yeah, by putting a strategy in place, because we started with that strategy word, you're turning feedback into a valuable resource for improving your workplace. And that's what you want to do, because that will feed through into performance and productivity improvements and mitigate risks that you will otherwise have in either good or bad times trading conditions. And that's what the Engage for Success movement was all about. Those early pioneers that we started with, I think they'd be delighted to see how the next generations have moved this on, but there's no room for complacency, and there really shouldn't be any backsliding. This should be an accelerating focus and trend for HR in the next few years.
We've got a question from Mary, actually. Any resources for aspiring employee experience professionals building employee listening from the ground up? So I can answer that, Mary, and say that we have lots. So probably the most powerful thing that I can share, if you're right at the start of your journey, is an employee experience framework ebook that we created that helps you to think about how to measure engagement, the themes of the employee experience to think about and the right questions to ask, and then how to think about linking engagement to the business metrics that we've talked about, like retention. So we will include that in the follow-up email that we send, and the WorkBuzz website is a great resource for that as well. Anything from your perspective, Neil, that you can signpost for Mary?
If you're not already involved, I would suggest you do look at the Engage for Success movement website, and you will find a very large number of companies, case studies, and further research and tools and people to engage with. So WorkBuzz is source number one, but don't forget other sources and look wider. And if anybody on this call wants to talk to me personally about anything that they're concerned or interested about, and I can help you in any way, then I'll do my best to provide you with a little bit of time or advice. So again, ask me if you want to.
But to kick off kind of the follow-up that you'll receive on the back of today, we'll send the slides from the webinar across along with a recording so you can listen and share with colleagues. We'll do an overview of the key points and also an article that Neil wrote about the future of employee listening that adds weight to some of the things that we've talked about as well. If you want to talk anything through, then feel free to get in touch either with myself, and Emily and Fiona from WorkBuzz will be in touch kind of as a follow-up from this if anyone does want to kind of have further discussions with WorkBuzz around this. But as Neil said, we're both on LinkedIn, so feel free to contact us through LinkedIn or any other means. But a massive thank you to Neil for sharing his wisdom and his experiences as always. We love webinars with Neil. It's one of my favorite things to do, and he makes me better at what I do because he just I don't know what the word is, he's so willing to share his wisdom with everyone. So a massive thank you to Neil, and a massive thank you to everyone for joining today, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Dawn.
Bye.
Bye-bye.